Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. And it's been a while since excuse me, allergies, since I've made an episode. I've been busy with work and uh, busy trying to get some research done and resubmitted for publication. Had to settle things with my mom's estate and other things. So I've been away for a while. And also, I guess I have a tendency to just get stuck in this rut of being content to hide behind my computer screen and uh, tweet at people rather than getting in front of a camera and doing a video. So I'm trying to. Today's an attempt to kind of break out of that rut and get back to doing this because I do like doing this, and I try to when I make a video, I try to research whatever the issue is, as thoroughly as I can, and think about and maybe jot down notes on what I'm going to say and so forth. Maybe my perfectionist tendencies tend to get the better of me sometimes too. So anyway, here I am at long last, and today I wanted to talk about an issue that I've often thought about over the last few years as I've seen people either, for example, you have very different points of view on most issues, but then there's some often pretty important issue, such as freedom for Julian Assange or uh, opposition to U.S. military intervention somewhere or things like that, uh, where those same people who disagree on most everything else strongly agree. And the flip side is that people who you agree with on most things can strongly disagree with you on some specific issue, and you just can't see eye to eye on it, no matter what. So I guess to kind of summarize what I'm getting at, people are complicated, and there are disadvantages to this common tendency we have to want to place people at a particular point on the left-right political spectrum or label people, put them in a box. Even the bidimensional, left, right, authoritarian, libertarian, or maybe it's the other way around, authoritarian, libertarian political spectrum really doesn't do justice to the complexity of people's uh, political ideologies and values. And, even generally well informed people have blind spots, they have areas where they aren't well informed, and they often don't admit to not being well informed. People have egos. They don't like to admit that they might be wrong about things. Um, and they may, in fact, even if they're politically very um, anti-establishment or leftists or whatnot, or really anywhere on the political spectrum, people can be very close-minded and really dig in their heels if anyone, even somebody who largely agrees with them politically, challenges what they believe or know about some particular issue. And at its extreme, we have many people who somehow get the impression that they know just as much or perhaps more about something than somebody who's devoted their career to studying it, or at least somebody who's put a considerable amount of time into developing expertise about a given topic. Um, and people think that watching a few YouTube videos makes you on a par with that. Um, and that's just not the case. Um, but, I got the idea for this episode as a result of well, I've had it before, but anyway, I decided to do it based on a conversation I had in a Twitter uh, group, message group that I'm in, where people were talking about how, in their opinion, if somebody was anti-vax, that placed them on the far right politically. So somebody said anti-vax stuff is far right. The movement was born out of white supremacy. Here's a leftist website which goes into the roots of the anti-vax movement and how it was born out of hate. And David Gorski, who runs the uh, popular science website, sciencebased would strongly disagree with this idea that you can just pin down the anti-vax movement, which he's written a lot about, and other people on his site have, as stemming from just one place in terms of political ideology or what have you. Um, there's always been, for example, this sort of crunchy granola, so to speak, element to people who are against vaccines and against other standard medical treatments like chemotherapy for cancer, and promotes various not necessarily so well proven alternatives. Um, as many of you know, I'm vegan, and there are quite a few vegans out there. Probably not the majority, I would say, but a sizable minority who are anti-vax and generally into conspiracy theories about a lot of things. The 9/11 conspiracies and so forth. Which, I mean, it's not necessarily so easy to place conspiracy, proneness to conspiracy, believing in conspiracy theories or promoting conspiracy theories at a particular point on the ideological spectrum. Sure, there are some that are more associated with some political viewpoints than others. It's a lot more likely that right wingers will be climate change deniers and saying the idea of anthropogenic climate change is a hoax, and there's more people on the left, perhaps, who you know hard to think of an example here. Um, more people on the left who believe that 9/11 was an inside job, because that grew out of people involved in the peace movement to an extent. But with all of these views, all of these conspiracy theories, there's considerable diversity in terms of the political views of the people who hold those points of view. Um, but let me just maybe give you a few examples of people who have just sort of complex mixtures of political views, and you can't necessarily pin them down, or they have a particular point of view that is at odds with their predominant viewpoint. So take Tucker Carlson, for example. In general, he's on the right. Probably most people who aren't big fans of his would agree that he's a racist. But on the other hand, he's been pretty outspoken in supporting, for example, freedom for Julian Assange, and just in general, supporting whistleblowers who are calling out corrupt practices by governments and corporations. He's been opposed to U.S. military intervention on a number of occasions. You take someone like Ryan Grimm from The Intercept and the YouTube show Rising. In general, I think most people who are to his left would think of him as very sort of liberal, mainstream Democratic establishment in terms of his point of view. He was railing against China in a very sort of typical Cold Warrior fashion the other day on Rising. Um, and yet, he's done some good reporting. He did excellent reporting on debunking the smears against Tara Reid, for example, when she came out with her allegations that Joe Biden harassed and assaulted her. Ryan Grimm took up for her. I've got to give him credit for that, even though I disagree a lot with his foreign policy views, with his support for the left wing of the Democratic parties, and so on. One of his counterparts on Rising, new host Kim Iverson. She's in general pretty progressive on a variety of foreign policy issues. She was the one who kind of got into it with Ryan Grimm on China, pushing back against the mainstream view that China was engaged in genocide in Xinjiang and so on. She's been to Palestine and done some good reporting on what she saw there, and basically sided with the Palestinians and understood their oppression and the horrific brutality inflicted on them by Israel. On the other hand, she has, during the COVID pandemic, tended to kind of minimize its impact and just be very superficial in terms of how she's reported on things, pushes anti-vax views quite a bit, and so forth. And overall, her views are really kind of a mixture that doesn't fit neatly at one point on the so-called left-right political spectrum. Max Blumenthal, great on foreign policy. He's the founder of the Gray Zone, which is just an excellent site for reporting on foreign policy issues. In general, Max has been solidly on the left for a long time, if you want to use that framework to categorize his politics. But he's really kind of gone overboard with minimizing COVID and basically saying vaccines don't work, and that mandates are this egregious violation of civil liberties and so forth. More on that in another episode. In fact, many people who are hardcore Julian Assange supporters, I've noticed this. It's like their main issue. They'll have the little clover on their Twitter timeline and speak about the issue of oppression of journalists and whistleblowers who speak out against the U.S. Establishment. They, in general, seem to be, they think of themselves as on the left politically. In terms of their philosophy, they seem to be sort of libertarian with a capital L in a lot of respects, and very against things like vaccine mandates or a lot of other restrictions on individual liberty that are enacted for the purpose of protect basically the good of society, protecting people from harm by other people, and just in general to buy into uh, anti-vaccine ideology. I've also noticed, as you may know, if you've seen this channel before, I've been vegan and an animal rights activist for a couple of decades now, um, and have found that, uh, on one hand, most vegans uh, tend to be pretty uninformed politically. I'd say that, in general, kind of the default political mode for vegans is, liberal. So they, Republicans bad, Democrats, pretty good, or at least the ones who are more on the so-called progressive or left end of the Democratic Party spectrum, like AOC or Bernie Sanders. They love people like that. And then, there are quite a few who are more to the left. Um, but, conversely, quite a few people on the left are very ill informed about veganism, mistakenly thinking of vegans as privileged people who can afford what purportedly is an expensive diet, and they tend to think of it as just being about diet and not, animal rights. And you know, uh, I'll talk about this in another episode. It's one of many stereotypes about veganism that aren't true. Vegan food is actually much cheaper than um, food containing animal products, whether it be meat or cheese or what have you. And in fact, if you look around the world, the countries that consume the least meat are poorer countries. But anyway, don't want to get off into that. Just to say, there's kind of a lack of understanding. Um, and one fellow that I follow on Twitter and interact with quite a lot, because he seems like a really well-informed guy generally, um, very progressive, and understands science well enough to understand that vaccination is a good and necessary thing to deal with the COVID pandemic, but other measures also, like wearing masks in public being important, and so forth. But he's one of those people who's very ill informed about veganism, and just recently was bashing people who fed their dogs a vegan diet, saying they were being cruel to their dogs, and didn't understand dogs' nutritional needs and were harming them and so forth. And I said to him, well, look, I had dogs who, for most of their lives, were on vegan diets, like 13 and 14 years respectively, that they were alive. They lived, pretty long life, were very healthy. I know many other vegans slash animal rights activists who feed their dogs vegan diets because they don't want to uh, give money to animal agriculture, animal agribusiness in order to feed their pets. But make sure that their nutritional needs are met, and generally have very healthy and happy animals who live a long life. And so there's just a lot of misinformation that um, you know, our pets are, well, cats are carnivores. A little harder to feed them a vegan diet, but dogs are omnivores. They can eat anything. They just need more protein than we do. Well, again, I'm kind of getting off onto a tangent here, but just making the point that there are people who can be really well informed about some things, but then very misinformed about others. Um, Another great example, uh, many of you who've been around in political activism for a while may remember Alexander Cockburn, a well-known journalist who founded Counterpunch magazine way back when. Died a few years ago from cancer, unfortunately, but just a great journalist. I thought very smart and witty, very left wing, um, and he was generally critical of sort of the conspiracist mentality that overtook many on the left after the Iraq War, where um, people started to believe that 9/11 was an inside job and so on and so forth. And, you know, uh, as I've discussed before on the show, you know, I don't buy that. And, it seems pretty clear to me that um, you know, terrorists from the Middle East who had plenty of grievances against the United States flew planes into buildings in New York City and Washington D.C. And if you understand the details of what happened, it's pretty clear that that was enough to bring buildings down, Twin Towers in New York, and damage other buildings sufficiently so that either they collapsed or they were had to be demolished later on. Anyway, getting back to Alexander Cockburn, um, he was a climate change denier. He did not think anthropogenic climate change was a real thing. I'm not sure where he got this idea, but he thought this was sort of some I don't know, big solar or something, conspiring to get people to believe that we needed to get off of fossil fuels. In order to save the planet from climate change. Um, so he bought into an idea that is, we very much associate with the right, even though he was, a left winger. Think of somebody like Tulsi Gabbard and where to categorize her politically. Uh, a lot of people, just immediately jump to the conclusion because she goes on Fox News a lot and she has spoken about the importance of combating terrorism. Um, you know, doesn't buy into sort of the woke left perspective on um, gender and transgender issues. Um, you know, has sort of mixed views on immigration and border control and so forth. Um, so people say, "Oh, she's a Republican. She may as well join the Republicans," or she's a right winger or whatnot. But I mean, if you look at uh, what she stood for politically as a congressperson and who she is, I mean, she was the only legislator to introduce a comprehensive climate change bill. AOC's Green New Deal was just a toothless resolution that didn't have very many specific detailed proposals in it. Uh, Tulsi was the only member of Congress to consistently speak out in favor of freedom for Julian Assange, and he spoke out on the day of his arrest in April. I think it was April 10th, 2019. Generally very opposed to U.S. Military intervention, opposed U.S. intervention in Syria throughout her congressional career, starting in 2013 until she left office, a few months ago. Um, was also one of the few members of Congress to be vegan, and really the only one who was very outspoken about animal rights or the destructiveness of animal agriculture in terms of its impact on the climate and the environment generally. At the same time, and contrary to popular belief, she did support Medicare for all, even though, generally speaking, her healthcare plan was, I think, rightly regarded as not being as good as Bernie Sanders' plan or Pramila Jayapal's plan, which Tulsi was an endorser of, by the way, because it allowed for a bigger role for private insurance than the plans that were bills in Congress. And her views on Israel and Palestine were a bit disappointing. She was opposed to BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. She did condemn Israeli human rights violations on occasion, but really didn't seem all that well informed about the Palestine issue. In general, her views on that particular issue didn't seem to be at all distinguishable from those of Bernie Sanders or most members of the squad, excepting those like Rashida Tlaib, who are intimately connected with that issue because she has relatives there. But in general, most of Congress was either or super bad on the Israel-Palestine issue, and that continues today. And Tulsi was sort of in the camp as far as that issue. So definitely a politically mixed bag. But overall, you'd have to say she's, if you were gonna do the putting people on a left-right spectrum, you'd have to say she was and is to the left of the vast majority of members of Congress. Not that that's saying much at all. One of the most interesting, to me, examples of somebody with very mixed political views is my friend David, a fellow vegan and animal rights activist, and activists generally. I knew David because he's from Bloomington, where I live, and we hung out a lot for several years, and went to and organized protests all the time. I once went to the protest back in 2001 against George Bush when he was inaugurated as president with David and several of David's friends. They were all anarchists, like most of the people in the local activist scene were. Also all vegan, as was I, and I am, and David still is. If I were going to label myself politically, I'd say, I'm definitely not an anarchist. I'm more a revolutionary socialist. I voted for Ralph Nader in 2000. They all thought that voting was a waste of time. We're all vegans, but one issue that we strongly disagreed on, interestingly enough, was abortion. They were all adamantly anti-abortion because they basically, part of their philosophy that led them to be vegan was, they considered all life to be sacred, and so even the lives of fetuses you couldn't take and be an ethical vegan according to them. Whereas I was very much pro-choice, still am. And my philosophy is that at the stage of pregnancy when the overwhelming majority of fetuses are aborted, they're not sentient, they're not conscious. And so to me, that's not an ethical issue, whereas women's reproductive rights is a very important ethical issue. But they didn't agree with that. They were all adamantly anti-abortion, which, you'd have to say that in terms of the left-right political spectrum, that's unquestionably a very right-wing position. And, I've kept up with David's since then, we're still friends. He still thinks of himself as an anarchist, but I gotta say, he sounds more and more like a liberal and less like an anarchist these days. I still like him, um, but we have more political disagreements than we used to. Interestingly enough, one thing that we agree on now is he's very much pro-choice, and we concur wholeheartedly. I think on um, reproductive rights issues. Um, but David defends voting for lesser evil Democrats like Biden and Clinton, which he did, even though he lives in California, which is obviously just automatically going to go for Democrats in any election that isn't already going to the Republican presidential candidate. We've gotten into a lot of arguments about that, even though he, for the most part, agreed with me that Biden was horrible, that he was likely guilty of rape of Tara Reid and sexual harassment or assault with other people. But he has really kind of big time Trump derangement syndrome. He buys into Russiagate, which we've also argued about. Um, we're both still vegan though, so we agree on that. And most things politically we do agree on. But as I said, if you were going to slap a label on him, you really couldn't, because he's kind of got a mixture of sort of liberal and leftist views. So, I guess in a nutshell, to make a long story short, y'all people are complicated. Um, and it's really hard and doesn't do justice to the complexity of how people think. To pigeonhole people or place them at a particular point on the left-right ideological spectrum, or even in a two-dimensional space, left-right, libertarian, authoritarian, or what have you. Um, it isn't that simple, and also, people are different in other ways that affect their political views. People differ in their degree of compassion for other people, the extent to which they're sort of individualistic and the way they look at things, where their focus is on, extremely centered on individual liberty to the, at the expense of any other value. Hence the opposition to vaccine mandates, for example, from that crowd. Um, Other people are very sort of collectivist, group-minded in their orientation, really place high importance on being in solidarity with other people and people looking out for each other, and society, even governments that we otherwise don't like, having the right or the authority to do things that put restrictions on certain individual liberties for the good of society as a whole. People differ in all kinds of other ways. People differ in the extent to which they're open or closed-minded. Most people of pretty much all political persuasions I've found are more toward the latter end. It's very, very hard to change their mind. Any of us who've engaged in much discussion of politics know this to be true. People may have psychological reasons why they're invested in particular points of view, which we can get into in a whole lot more detail on some or other occasion. People are people, and it's not easy to pin down who they are or where they fall ideologically. People are often inconsistent. Okay, well, thanks for watching. I will see you next time.